Not a skeleton, not a shipwreck, not a body pulled from the sea. The town of Edam recorded something far stranger, a living creature caught in the shallows, neither fully human nor fully fish. The year was 1608. Dutch merchants ruled the world's oceans, and their clerks kept meticulous records. What entered those records that year was not cargo or a route, it was a creature, and the city chose to believe it. What did the magistrates of Edam actually see, sign, and seal into their official records? The dikes of Edam held back the Zuiderzee with timber gates and packed earth, forming a wall between the city and the open sea. Fishermen worked those shallows before dawn, dragging nets across the mudflats with practiced and unhurried hands every morning. In 1608, a net returned something the men did not recognize as fish and did not recognize as human. The creature was small, pale, and still alive when they hauled it onto the planks of their flat-bottomed boat. Its lower body was covered in dark scales, smooth along the spine, rough and dense toward what should have been feet. Its upper body was proportioned like a woman, with long hair matted flat against its shoulders by the cold water. The fishermen did not kill it. They bound it with rope and sailed back toward the harbour without speaking to each other. At the Edam dock, a crowd gathered before the boat had even finished tying its lines to the wooden post. A merchant named Gerrit van der Meer was the first person of record to approach the creature and document what he observed. Van der Meer noted it made no sound, opened its mouth without producing a cry, and kept its eyes fixed on the water. The harbour master sent a runner to the town hall within the hour. The runner carried a message with a single instruction: "Come and see." 3 members of the municipal council arrived at the dock before midday, accompanied by a clerk carrying a leather-bound ledger. The clerk opened the ledger, uncapped his ink, and began to write while the creature was still lying on the dock planks. What he wrote became the foundational document of the Edam Mermaid case, a record that would survive 4 intact centuries. The entry described the creature's physical dimensions, the location of capture, the names of the fishermen, and the date. It did not use the word mermaid. It used a Dutch term that translates more precisely and deliberately as sea woman. That single word choice would become one of the most debated details in the entire case across generations of Dutch historians. A sea woman implied something observed and carefully named, not something drawn from myth and simply assumed to exist. The council convened that same afternoon in the town hall, a rectangular stone building with high windows above the market square. They debated 3 options: release the creature back into the shallows, transport it to Amsterdam, or retain it under municipal custody. They chose custody. The decision was recorded with the same bureaucratic neutrality applied to property disputes and tax assessments. A room was prepared in the house of a widow named Aaltje Peters, located 2 streets east of the main canal. Peters had dealt with the council before, renting space to travellers and housing a visiting official from Utrecht the previous year. The creature was carried from the dock wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas, still bound and still completely silent throughout. Peters later told her neighbours that the creature did not struggle when it was placed into the wooden tub filled with water. It looked at the walls of the room, then at her, then at the water, and it did not move after that. The tub was shallow, barely enough to submerge the lower body. The creature remained in it the entire night without complaint. That first night, Peters left a candle burning on the table and did not sleep. She sat in the doorway and watched. By morning, she had noticed something the harbour clerk had not recorded. The creature's left hand bore 3 thin marks, parallel, pressed deep into the skin. The marks were not from the rope. They ran the wrong direction, and they were already beginning to fade before Brewer ever arrived. The council assigned a physician named Adrian Brouwer to examine the creature on the third day of its captivity in Peter's house. Brewer was not a man given to exaggeration. His previous reports to the council concerned grain rot and a fever outbreak near the docks. He arrived at Peter's house with a small leather case, a measuring string, and a notebook bound with brown cord and a brass clasp. The examination lasted 2 hours. Brewer announced each action aloud before performing it, a precaution he offered no explanation for. He measured the span of its shoulders, the length of its torso, and the thickness of the scaled section below the waist. His notes recorded that the scales were not attached like armor. They grew from the skin itself, continuous and without any visible seam. He pressed one scale with his thumbnail and wrote that it did not detach, did not crack, and showed no sign of bleeding. The creature watched him throughout the examination with what Brower described in careful language as deliberate and sustained attention. He wrote that it tracked his hands, not his face, following each instrument as it moved rather than the person holding the instrument. When he produced the measuring string near its face, it turned its head slowly away from the string and toward the plaster wall. Brewer returned to the town hall and filed a report of 3 pages written in a controlled and consistently narrow script. He stated that the creature's chest moved in a pattern consistent with breathing air, and that its eyes responded normally to direct light. He stated that he could find no gills, no external organ of aquatic respiration, and no water-breathing mechanism he could identify. His final sentence read, "I cannot determine the origin of this creature through any method available to me at the present time." The council filed his report in the ledger alongside the capture entry and immediately requested a second opinion from outside the city. A theologian named Peter van Houten was summoned from Alkmaar to review the documentation and examine the creature if he judged it necessary. Van Houten arrived 4 days later, read Brouwer's full report, and asked to be taken to Peter's house immediately without delay. He stood in the doorway of the room for several minutes before entering. He did not speak or gesture during that interval. When he finally approached the tub, he knelt at its edge and studied the creature's face from a distance of less than 1 foot. He stood, returned to the council chamber, and delivered his opinion verbally before it was transcribed word for word by the clerk. Van Houten said the creature was not a demon. He said this clearly without qualification, hedging, or any condition attached. He added that he could not confirm it was human, and that the question of its possession of a soul remained, in his view, entirely unresolved. The council recorded his assessment and adjourned. The ledger now contained a physician's report, a theologian's opinion, and no conclusion. Peters continued to house the creature. She brought bread first, which it ignored completely, then raw fish purchased from the morning market. The creature ate the fish directly from her hand on the 5th day, a detail the clerk entered into the ledger that same afternoon. That single entry was the first recorded instance of voluntary behavior. Every entry before it had described the creature as entirely passive. The note read, "It accepted food, looked at Peters before eating, and did not look away from her face while it ate." A second note written directly below it posed a question the clerk left unanswered. Does it recognize her, or does it recognize only the food? That question was the last entry in the ledger for 11 consecutive days. The following entry was dated the following month entirely. The gap was never explained in any subsequent document. No record described what occurred during those 11 days or why documentation ceased. By the 2nd month of captivity, the creature had begun to examine the objects inside Peter's house with visible and sustained attention. A wooden spindle left near the tub was the first object it touched without being directed or encouraged by anyone in the room. Peters watched from the doorway as it reached for the spindle in the early morning before anyone else had arrived at the house. The creature turned the spindle slowly over in both hands for several minutes, then set it back exactly where it had been. The clerk came that afternoon and placed 3 objects near the tub: the spindle, a wooden spoon, and 1 small brass button. The creature touched all 3 in sequence. It held the button longest, nearly 10 minutes, turning it toward the light from the window. The clerk's entry read, "The creature examines the reflective surface of the button with concentrated and repeated attention. The reason remains unknown to us." Over the weeks that followed, Peters began speaking near the creature during her daily household tasks, not addressing it, but within its range of hearing. She narrated her actions aloud: boiling water on the hearth, folding cloth at the table, sweeping the boards near the front door. The creature never responded with sound, but it began to orient its upper body toward her voice whenever she began to speak. By the third month, it had learned to hold a wooden cup without dropping it and to drink from it without spilling. Peters had taught it this over many mornings, demonstrating the motion with her own cup until the creature slowly mirrored her. The council's autumn report noted without commentary that the creature was, in the clerk's measured phrase, adapting to domestic conditions. A visitor from the city of Horn arrived in late December and formally requested permission to observe the creature through the doorway. The council refused his request, and the refusal was recorded under the same language used to manage crowds at public executions: preservation of public order. By the following spring, the creature had developed clear gestures: a raised hand toward the window, a turn toward the door, a press against the tub. Peters interpreted each gesture and acted on her reading of them, moving the tub closer to the glass and changing the water more frequently. The clerk recorded her 3 interpretations as Peters' personal observations and noted explicitly that they were not confirmed communications from the creature itself. The language of the ledger shifted gradually in these spring entries, moving away from the clinical toward the careful and the qualified. That shift in register was the first visible sign that the people nearest to the creature had begun to relate to it differently than before. They were no longer treating it as evidence to be catalogued. They were treating it as something that had preferences and found ways to express them. The council's next formal review was scheduled for midsummer. Before it convened, Peters sent an urgent written message directly to the town hall. The creature had made a sound in the night. Not a word and not a cry, but a single low note sustained for several full seconds. Peters described the sound in her message as the noise a person produces when they are attempting not to weep. The council received her message on a Tuesday morning and did not respond for 6 days. No reason for the delay was recorded anywhere. When they did respond, they sent the clerk to document the sound if it occurred again during his monitoring visits to the house. The clerk filed a report noting, "No further vocalization was observed during 3 visits spanning 9 days of careful monitoring." Below that entry, someone had drawn a single thin horizontal line in a different and darker ink. No name or date was written beside it. The gap in documentation lasted 11 days. No council session was called during that interval, and no clerk visited the house. Whatever occurred between those 2 dated entries remained outside the reach of any official record the city of Edam would ever produce. The Midsummer Council Review was held in the town hall on a warm afternoon with the high windows open and flies collecting near the ink pot. Peters was asked to deliver her account directly to the full council, an unusual request since women rarely addressed formal municipal proceedings. She stood at the far end of the long oak table and spoke for approximately 20 minutes without written notes or any assistance. She described the spindle, the brass button, the wooden cup, the 3 gestures, and the sound she had heard alone in the night. She said the creature had begun to watch her face when she was distressed and to remain completely still when she was calm. She said it had learned to distinguish the sound of rain striking the roof from the sound of someone approaching the front door. One council member interrupted her account to ask directly whether she believed the creature to be an intelligent being. Peters paused before answering. She answered that it understood considerably more than it was able to express, and that this was a different question than whether it was intelligent. The council recorded her testimony in full, and then turned to a question they had been formally deferring for over 12 months. The recorded question was this: should the creature be formally classified under Dutch law, and if so, under what category of being does it fall? They voted 5-2, to defer classification a second time. The 2 dissenting votes were not attributed to any named member in the record. The deferral left the creature in a legal position that had no existing name, housed by the city, fed by its authority, but officially unclassified. Brower returned for a second medical examination that summer and found the creature's physical condition largely unchanged from his visit 18 months prior. He recorded one new observation. The scaled portion of its body had developed small areas of pale discoloration concentrated near the lower spine. He described the discoloration as consistent with what he had previously observed in fish removed from cold water and maintained in warmer conditions over time. He did not interpret the finding or draw any conclusion from it. He closed his notebook and left the house without further remarks. The winter following that examination was colder than the previous one. Peters burned additional wood and positioned 2 oil lamps on either side of the tub. The creature's appetite declined. The gesture toward the window increased in frequency until it occupied most of the available daylight hours. The facts, stripped of interpretation, are these. A creature was captured in the Zuiderzee shallows in the spring of 1608. It was examined by a physician, assessed by a theologian, housed by a widow, and officially classified by no one for the duration of its life. It died in captivity, in a shallow wooden tub, in a rented room 2 streets from the canal, while the council debated whether it had a soul. The most consistent explanation is not supernatural. It is institutional. The council recognized something it could not categorize and chose to contain it rather than confront it. Brower's reports describe a creature physiologically adapted to cold salt water, maintained in a warm, shallow freshwater tub for over a year. The pale discoloration he documented near its spine was not a curiosity. It was a sign of systemic deterioration, consistent with prolonged environmental deprivation. The 11-day gap in documentation, the horizontal line in darker ink, and the council's refusal to reclassify the creature were not coincidences. They were decisions. The most consistent version is that the council knew it was dying, chose not to act, and ensured the ledger reflected as little of that as possible. No official was ever named in connection with its death. Peter's final letter was filed without response, and her name appears in no subsequent municipal record. The case was not suppressed. It was simply left incomplete. The ledger survived, the measurements survived, the gap survived. The creature did not. Edam continued to function as a trading city. The house on the canal was rented again within the season. No marker was placed. No inquiry was opened. If the council held records of its decline, who decided no one would ever answer?